Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this latest edition of Tales from Outer Space, where I take stories from across the internet and read them for your entertainment. This particular story is called Humans Like a Good Fight, written by Teller of Tall Tales. The mouse-like journalist sat across from the scarred human. Audio recorder set on the table between them as she scratched an ear and went over her question sheets. The human across from her smoked a hand-rolled cigarette. A two-handed bastard sword leaned against the table edge beside him. Satisfied that she had her questions in order, the journalist politely cleared her throat before asking the first question on her list, gently tapping the start on the audio recorder at the same time. So, Mr. Alexandros, rumor has it that you and your company fought in every major conflict since the Human Liberation War. Can you put those rumors to rest for me? The human slowly stubbed their cigarette out before setting the sheathed bastard sword on the table. Collecting his thoughts, the human slowly replied, Alexandros is my sword's name. Please, call me Drake. As for the rumors... Drake laughed softly, almost feeling the mud of a trench floor beneath his boots as he remembered the best years of his life. They're, somewhat incorrect. I fought in almost every conflict in the past 60 years or so. Some lasted only a few days after I got there. The mercenary chuckled, lighting another cigarette. The journalist nodded before asking a question not on her list. You're 75 years old, aren't you? That'd mean that you've been fighting wars since before you could legally pilot a hovercraft. What draws a man into a lifestyle so young? The mercenary stared at the journalist, a face impassive, surprised by the question. Drake glanced at his cigarette, a smoke circle swirling towards the ceiling, much like the smoke curled in the air that day. Nobody's ever asked me that before, so I'll give you the truth about what draws a 15-year-old boy into fighting other men's wars. Drake took a long drag of his cigarette, staring off into the distance as he thought back 50 years. As most know, back then, humanity was just yet another slave race, pacified through violence and eugenics. But there were a certain subset that kept around for blood sports, gladiator matches, and the like. Drake leaned forward, staring down at the sword in his simple black scabbard, the memories as crisp as the day they were formed. Children like myself were dragged off to fight promising young Geknoshan warriors. A rite of passage for the rich and privileged was to kill a human in one-on-one melee combat. Drake slowly drew the sword from its scabbard, inspecting the leaf-shaped blade's razor edge. If the human won, them and their village would be granted their freedom. If they lost, nothing changed. An impossible challenge, but what do you expect? Drake stood and pointed the sword out, in a line with his arm. Well, it was supposed to be impossible. Garavan Vandal took a deep breath of the blood-soaked arena. He held his Felks in his glue grip at his side. The forward-curving blade is the only worthwhile invention that he'd seen in human history. The human boy at the other end of the sandpit stared back, eyes hollow, resigned, hopeless. Their leaf-bladed bastard sword held in a loose one-handed grip. Garavan grinned as he started to approach the young man, thinking about how sweet the sight of that decapitated head would look on his wall. As Garavan approached to within 10 paces, the human moved the first time, holding the sword with two hands at their waist. The wide tip of the sword was angled upwards to eye level. Garavan just laughed at the human's sloppy guard and suddenly defiant eyes. Lunging forward, Garavan threw a lateral cut aimed to take the human's head off. To everyone's surprise, the human repositioned their sword at lightning speed, the Fox blade skittering along the humans as Garavan overextended. The human rotated their wrists around each other, then the flat-bellied tip of the human sword flying for Garavan's neck. The young Geknoshan soldier bent awkwardly back as the tip of the human sword whistled in front of his face. Garavan stumbled back, regaining his balance as the human adjusted their grip, the sword hanging low and pointy behind them, poised for the upwards cut or to more easily deflect or riposte a downwards blow. The worst part according to Caravan. The human was smiling. Caravan felt his blood boil at the human's insolence. He tightened his grip, holding his sword diagonally across his chest as he drew the dagger provided him. He wasn't screwing around anymore, and neither was the human. Before Caravan could switch his dagger into a better fighting grip, the human lunged. Instead of an upward cut he was expecting, the human feinted and sidestepped Caravan's swing. Not unscathed, though, as the falx's curved tip hit the line across the boy's forearm. The human retaliated, twisting with the momentum of the sidestep and letting go of the sword with one hand to widen the swing, scoring a hit across Caravan's cheek. The two swordsmen stared each other down after the last exchange, both breathing hard from adrenaline. Tauntingly, the human raised their sword up with one hand just beneath the crossguard, the tip in line with the rest of their arm. Caravan saw red as the human smirked and twisted the sword so the edge was parallel to the ground. He wildly sprinted forward, swinging his falx with every ounce of his strength he had as the human let the sword tip fall towards the ground, so he pointed it straight down, holding it slightly away from his body as it blocked and caught the edge of the falx against his bastard swords. Caravan stabbed his dagger towards the human throat, feeling a bite into flesh. Caravan's elation wavered as he saw the human hand pierced through and through by the dagger, holding its point away from their throat. Caravan disengaged and leapt back, leaving his dagger embedded in the human's palm. In utter disbelief, he watched the human pull the dagger from his hand with his teeth. Then, in one smooth motion, it dropped from his mouth, pinched the dagger's tip with his pierced hand, and flicked it at Caravan's face. In a split-second decision, Caravan lifted his falx and deflected the thrown dagger. A balloon of triumph filled his stomach as he was about to finish this petulant human off. That balloon was puffed by the fat-bellied tip of the human's leaf-blade bastard sword as it ran the young Geknosian soldier through. Caravan looked down at the blade buried to the crossguard just below his rib cage, then at the madly grinning human who still held onto it, a long, bleeding cut across their face from where they'd headbutted the falx as they attacked. Caravan felt his vision darken as the human softly sighed. Good fight, Geknosian. Even now, as he was skewered on the human's blade, he couldn't agree more. His rage quenched with his own lifeblood. He knew he'd been beaten fair and square. Good fight, human. Caravan fell to his knees as the human ripped the sword free. One final cut severing Caravan's head, rolling across the sandy arena floor. Drake slowly lowered his blade, arms aching as he hadn't realized how much he'd relived that fight. The Malcian journalist smiled at him before simply saying, "You enjoyed that fight, didn't you? There was a grin on your face the entire time you were telling the story." Drake chuckled, setting his sword down gently, laughingly. "Yes, ma'am. I learned then that I simply love a good fight. Nothing before or since has ever brought me that much joy. To walk the life of knife's edge without falling off is simply..." Drake relit his cigarette and took a long, happy drag. Sublime. The Malcian journalist smiled knowingly and began packing her things up, saying, "I hope you'll have time for me tomorrow. I'd love to hear more about your battles. The galaxy has a lot of questions for its mythical figures." Drake agreed with a hearty laugh. Sliding his sword back into its scabbard, he stated, "As long as you listen, I will talk." The Malcian smiled thankfully and extended her hand. "Thank you, Mr. Drake. It's been a pleasure." "You're always, welcome, miss." The Malcian chuckled at her own faux pas as the human shook her hand. The name Shine, spelled with an E-I-N instead of an I-N-E. "Nice to meet you, Miss Shine. I hope that we can talk again soon." Giving Drake a meek smile and walking to the door, Shine made a mental note to visit Drake again soon. However, while she was on the Litterford, she might as well check in with the cranky old cyborg that changed her life. End of story. I would quickly like to thank our Tier 5 patrons, Dragzoon WRE, Quantum Wednesday, Ambrose Catal, Lord Ashrakal, Bushmaster 177, Casper Arnholtz, Cam Maxwell, and Arcadian. Thank you very much.